In this treaty, we seek to establish freedom from aggression and from the use of force in the North Atlantic community. This is the area which has been at the heart of the last two world conflicts. To protect this area against war will be a long step toward permanent peace in the whole world.
From Mons and Brussels, Belgium, this is An Enduring Alliance, a podcast reflecting on the 70-year history of NATO and its oldest military headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
Welcome back to An Enduring Alliance, our podcast series on the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its oldest military headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE. Your hosts for today will be myself, Dr. Stella Adorf, the Chief Historical Advisor at SHAPE.
And I'm Dr. Linda Risso, I'm a History Consultant at SHAPE.
And I'm Master Sergeant Alex Burnett, a Media Operations Non-Commissioned Officer at SHAPE. Today we want to talk about why NATO moved from Paris to Brussels and SHAPE moved from Roquencourt to Casteau. In order to explain that move, we will speak about General Charles de Gaulle's vision for Europe and France.
By the end of 1967, the Atlantic Council decided to move NATO headquarters from Paris to Brussels.
I most warmly welcome the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
It was built in 6 months or 7 months. It was incredible.
When the alliance was founded, it was originally based in London. Later, it moved to Paris and into some very impressive headquarters buildings which faced the Eiffel Tower. Its military headquarters was based at Roquencourt just outside Paris. Now, why did NATO and its military headquarters move?
NATO and SHAPE moved in 1967. It was a hectic time, marked by major crises and changes in strategy. We have discussed this in the last episode, remember? NATO's strategic shift.
Yes, we spoke about the shift from massive retaliation, which meant an extensive use of nuclear weapons, to a more nuanced, flexible response in the 1960s.
Correct, but that shift was not welcomed by all NATO allies at the time. When SACEUR General Lyman Lemnitzer took over this office in 1863, it became clear that France did not agree with this policy change. Lemnitzer witnessed a growing estrangement between France and in particular its president, General Charles de Gaulle, and NATO.
But France's dissatisfaction with NATO and the United States course was a much longer development. The French government had repeatedly raised doubts over continued military cooperation with the United States and other allies throughout the 50s and 60s.
We have asked Professors Maurice Weiss and Pierre Bouillon to tell us more about France's role in the alliance in the first decades.
C'est vraiment la France, le territoire français, qui va se trouver au cœur de cette organisation du traité de l'Atlantique Nord.
So it is actually France, the territory of France, that we find at the heart of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So in some sense, we can say that France is playing a substantial role within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, within this alliance. At the same time, the French are realizing that their role and their influence are actually not all that significant, inasmuch as the Americans are tending to consolidate power and decisions. And the big posts, military or otherwise, are being given to Americans. General Eisenhower becomes the first commander-in-chief, etc. Consequently, seen from that vantage point, there was a problem resulting from the fact that the French felt that they were somehow in a minority within an increasingly structured alliance, where the Americans played a significant role with the British alongside them.
Qui devient beaucoup plus structuré et où les Américains jouent un rôle important avec à leur côté les Britanniques.
Après, effectivement, il y a tout un ensemble de malentendus qui émergent et qui tiennent au fait que la France réclame une alliance globale, c'est-à-dire qu'une alliance pas seulement sur le territoire européen.
After that, indeed, an entire range of misunderstandings surfaced due to the fact that France was calling for a worldwide alliance. In other words, an alliance not just on European territory, but an alliance that extended to every single territory in the world where one of the allies was involved. It makes perfect sense that one of the prime moments when that divergence became problematic was during the Suez Expedition in 1956. The French and the British had decided to conduct military strikes in the Egyptian Suez.
Devant la menace soviétique, mais aussi devant la menace états-unienne, eh bien, Français et Britanniques sont obligés.
France and the United Kingdom, although for various reasons faced with a threat from the Soviets and also the challenge from the Americans, were obliged, just as they stood poised to achieve military victory, both to concede major political defeat and to leave Egypt. In hindsight, it seems obvious that the Suez Expedition ought never to have been undertaken.
Puisque la France et la Grande-Bretagne, sur le plan diplomatique...
In 1860, France acquired its own nuclear capability for defensive purposes. The French presidents, who had just been re-elected, started reconsidering France's position in NATO.
Yes, he worked on establishing other formats, like a French, British, American security directorate, to ensure France's influence on the alliance's nuclear defense strategy. You're about to hear Professor Weiss and Bouillon again to tell us more about de Gaulle's views.
Les changements internationaux ont été multiples. Donc à partir de 1958, le premier changement, bien évidemment, c'est l'arrivée de Gaulle au pouvoir.
There were numerous changes internationally in those days. The first change was, of course, that starting in 1958, de Gaulle came to power and the Fifth Republic was founded due to the war in Algeria. That was the first big change because the hesitations that were already present during the Fourth Republic took on a fresh guise with de Gaulle, and it was his hesitation, in particular, that led to a fundamentally different political program. In other words, although the nuclear program was started during the Fourth Republic, it was not intended to become a platform supporting a foreign policy based on national independence. Once de Gaulle came to power, the nuclear program was put on the fast track, and it was the nuclear power, in particular, that would be hitched to a new perspective on international relations. What was the issue? The issue was that now the Soviets had the means to strike the territory of the United States directly.
Le problème, c'est que désormais les soviétiques ont les moyens de frapper directement avec les armes nucléaires le territoire des États-Unis.
De Gaulle thought that any US security guarantee for Western Europe would no longer be perfect because it was impossible to obtain any guarantee whatsoever that the United States would agree to expose themselves to nuclear destruction in order to protect populations which, in the end, were not the population of the United States. All of this was aggravated by the desire of the United States to change its strategic doctrine from massive retaliation to flexible response. In other words, the risk was in fact that Western Europe would once more become an extremely destructive conventional battlefield, just like it was during the Second World War. And now you have a nuclear battlefield. In other words, Europe would just simply be destroyed. For de Gaulle, well, this new doctrine was unacceptable, and it could not actually guarantee true security for Western Europe, still less for France. Out of this came the French desire to develop a strategic weapon that would make it possible to deter the USSR, in connection with a weak too strong strategy, from striking Western Europe, and of course, in particular, from striking France. So there was the nuclear issue, a major issue which played into de Gaulle's desire to develop an autonomous strategic arsenal that was not under the control of the United States, and which would enable France, henceforth in possession of a means to provide its own security, to conduct an independent foreign policy.
Que les États-Unis ne maîtrisent pas et qui permettent à la France, qui désormais aurait les moyens de sa propre sécurité, de pouvoir mener une politique étrangère indépendante.
Alors moi je dirais deux mots seulement. Le premier mot, c'est que oui.
I would just say two things. First, yes, Nuclear issues and the French nuclear weapons program have had a considerable influence, particularly in as much as de Gaulle had asked the Americans to help France in the nuclear arena, which the Americans refused to do. From that perspective, there was a true transatlantic misunderstanding inasmuch as the Americans had helped the British and then refused to help the French nuclear program. By that standard, yes, de Gaulle's concept of the Atlantic Alliance was very clearly oriented toward having the means and the instruments for remaining independent as a nation, which to say, a nuclear strike force, something that was an ongoing creation under the Fourth and the Fifth Republic, but which de Gaulle forged as his instrument of choice.
Continue entre la 4e et la 5e République, mais dont de Gaulle a fait son instrument privilégié.
De Gaulle disagreed with the shift of NATO's strategy from massive retaliation to a more flexible response without reliance on the nuclear first strike capability.
In his view, this new strategy could result in a weakened US commitment to the defense of Europe with nuclear weapons. He also perceives SHAPE and NATO's integrated military structure as a tool to subordinate French interests to American foreign policy.
Yes, de Gaulle was deeply critical of the flexible response strategy. We discussed the shift to flexible response in our previous episode when we explained that during the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, President John F. Kennedy realized that the world could easily reach the point of a nuclear war by accident under the massive retaliation strategy.
Applying the strategy of massive retaliation in any crisis situation could lead to war simply by miscalculation or misunderstanding, and it could result in mutual destruction of both sides of the Cold War.
Flexible response was considered by the US government as the best way forward to defend Europe and the North Atlantic area. However, de Gaulle remains critical.
In February 1966, he stated that France had to reestablish its sovereignty over French territory, meaning the American forces that had been present in France since the end of World War II, along with other allies, had to leave.
De Gaulle also announced that France would no longer participate in the NATO integrated military command structure, as it undermined France's sovereignty.
De Gaulle argued that the war situation had changed and that there was no justification for NATO military integration. SHAPE and AFCENT, the headquarters of the Allied Forces Central Europe, had to leave France by April 1967. That was really fast.
It is important to explain that although France left the integrated command structure of NATO, it did not withdraw from NATO as an ally.
Yes, France withdrew its military staff from SHAPE and from AFCENT, but continued to have a permanent delegation in the NATO headquarters.
AFCENT found its new home in the Netherlands. It moved to Brunsum near the German border. Today, this is the home of the Joint Force Command Brunsum.
Political leaders decided that NATO headquarters had to move as well. So, the HQ moved from Paris to the suburbs of Brussels, Belgium, in Ever, where we are recording this episode right now.
SACEUR and SHAPE moved to Belgium too. Being close to the NATO headquarters would have brought many advantages, but that was not possible. The Belgian authorities made a strong argument that SHAPE was a major wartime target that could not be moved anywhere near an urban, densely populated area. Let's not forget, we are in the middle of the Cold War.
Correct. And there were further restrictions. In order to limit costs and construction time, SHAPE had to move from France very quickly. The Belgian government decided that SHAPE had to be placed on land already owned by the government.
And that was the case for Camp Casteau. The camp was a Belgian Army summer training camp near Mons in Wallonie.
Belgium offered the construction of a high-speed motorway connecting Mons and Brussels, and SHAPE and NATO headquarters. The E-19 did not exist at that time.
The Belgian government made a strong case, and SHAPE moved to Camp Casteau, where it is based today.
This was a hectic time. The alliance had a bit more than 1 year to find a new home for SHAPE and the NATO headquarters. SACEUR was pretty amazed when what he called the miracle of Mons happened. That was that SHAPE was constructed within 6.5 months.
Thanks to an incredible 7-day-a-week building program, SHAPE was able to leave France before de Gaulle's deadline expired.
It was an amazing achievement that had been possible thanks to the tremendous coordination efforts between NATO, the Belgian government, and the local authorities.
It was almost unbelievable that SHAPE closed its facilities in Rokencourt on 30 March 1967 and on the next day held its opening ceremony to mark the opening of their new HQ in Casteau.
We commemorated this important event in SHAPE history in 2017, when we celebrated SHAPE's 50th anniversary in Belgium. This is what SACEUR Scaparotti said about this anniversary.
In 1966, when France had departed the NATO military system, chosen to do that, we needed to move a headquarters from Paris to someplace else. And Belgium stepped up to give that assistance and offered the Mons area as one of the options. And as you said, that was at a time where we needed to move a headquarters rather quickly. We were in the midst or the height of the Cold War, and it gave us a viable option of a location here that was near the political headquarters and also near other organizations that were important, like the Western European Union.
General Scaparotti confirms what General Lemnitzer said at that time. It was a tremendous effort. Here's audio from General Lemnitzer's speech.
This is a historic moment, and I hope that you will share with me the profound sentiments I feel in participating in this important event. My sentiments are threefold. First, a feeling of pride in the great accomplishments of SHAPE during the first 16 years of its existence. Second, a feeling of appreciation for the efforts of all those who have contributed to the development of this site in Belgium. And third, and above all, a feeling of dedication and resolution to the future of SHAPE, upon which the well-being, security, and prosperity of our North Atlantic Alliance so heavily depends. The rapid and effective preparation of this fine installation is indeed an accomplishment in which the Belgian nation can take the greatest satisfaction, and for which I would like to add my own deep appreciation. This construction miracle has been possible only through the tremendous spirit of cooperation and efficiency of Belgium, the government, Count de Kirchhoff and the members of his teams, the consortia and our architect engineers, the contractors, and most importantly, the Belgian workmen whose skill and hard work have earned the admiration and thanks of us all.
The move was quick and efficient, but problems continued. France had withdrawn from the military structure, but, remember, not from the alliance overall.
France was no longer represented in certain committees, like the Nuclear Planning Group and the Defense Planning Committee.
The withdrawal of France meant the removal of foreign forces from French territory and the withdrawal of French forces from NATO commands. The stationing of NATO weapons, including nuclear weapons, on French soil was also banned.
To make the situation even more pragmatic, NATO had to negotiate arrangements with French authorities to coordinate France's military role in the event of a Warsaw Pact attack.
On the one hand, France wanted complete withdrawal of French forces from the integrated command structure. On the other hand, General Lemnitzer wanted to secure the protection of the French zone in Germany.
General Lemnitzer and the Chief of Staff of the French Army, General Eyeret, eventually found an agreement that enabled the French army to participate in a potential NATO military operation while staying under national command.
French naval and air forces continued to participate in NATO exercises, and France took part in joint procurement projects such as the NATO Air Defense Ground Environment, which was a radar system conceived to detect high-speed enemy aircraft and, if necessary, destroy them.
Lemnitzer closed his tenure with the successful adoption of the new military strategy of flexible response in December 1967 and a workable agreement with the French.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, President François Mitterrand intended to lead France back into NATO's integrated military command structure.
This was a concept continued by his successor, President Jacques Chirac, and France reintegrated into the NATO military command structure in 2009, under President Nicolas Sarkozy.
The history of France's relations with NATO illustrates the flexibility of NATO membership. While the country maintained full nuclear autonomy, it continued to act in solidarity with the other allies and to play a political role within the alliance. We have asked Professor Weiss and Bouillon about the reasons behind France's decision to return to the integrated military structure of NATO.
Oui, alors si on passe des décennies 70-80.
If one goes from the decades of the 70s and 80s forward to 2009, the first thing one really needs to take into account is that we have moved from a Cold War world to a post-Cold War world and even a post-9/11 world. Everything has changed as a result, and first and foremost, the entire East-West rivalry. Naturally, one can say that we still find ourselves in a climate of rivalry, but it is not at all the same. Look at what was happening during the Cold War era, compared with post-1989 or post-1991, and you see a world that has changed utterly, consequently, that has an obvious impact on French policy, French diplomacy, and French military policy. Moreover, in addition to the geopolitical issues, there are also the more specifically military issues. At the time of the Cold War, it was the nuclear weapon. That is why it was so important for France to have its own nuclear weapons. Starting in 1989 to 1991, nuclear weapons were no longer the option of last resort, and they became weapons that could no longer be used any which way. Conflicts were on the rise. Contrary to the aspirations of the end of history, these were not conflicts that could be resolved with nuclear weapons. These conflicts could only be resolved through airborne or helicopter operations, and most often with troops on the ground, and certainly not with nuclear weekends.
Ces conflits, on ne peut les régler qu'avec des opérations
From that time forward, NATO's new strategic concept has placed particular emphasis on everything cooperation related and on the stabilizing role NATO is capable of playing on the political level throughout the European continent. In some sense, this brings NATO's mission objectives a bit more closely in line with the objectives that French diplomacy has traditionally set for itself since the 1960s.
La diplomatie française depuis les années 1960. À partir de 1991, les opérations militaires.
Starting in 1991, the military operations contemplated have been ostensibly for stabilization. Once a conflict situation had already broken out and the troops were only supposed to act on a voluntary basis, various coalitions were formed, and the questions of automatic response was no longer an issue that was being raised, which removed yet another hesitation on France's part regarding closer cooperation with NATO.
D'une coopération plus étroite avec l'OTAN.
The withdrawal of France accelerated the internal debate about political consultation and cooperation, and the role of NATO in the world.
NATO leaders recognized that the international environment had changed since 1949 and that the alliance had to adapt.
This debate led to an important document that has shaped the history of the alliance ever since. Officially named the Report of the Council on the Future Tasks of the Alliance, is commonly referred to as the Harmala Report from the name of its author, Pierre Hamel, former Belgian Prime Minister at that time.
The Harmala Report effectively introduced the notion that deterrence and détente are two sides of the same coin. The document set the scene for NATO's first steps towards a more cooperative approach to security.
This document stated NATO should take active part in disarmament and arms control talks. This is the détente part. Détente means relaxation, and it refers to a relaxation of tensions with the Soviet bloc.
However, NATO should do so from a position of military strength. To be taken seriously and to be able to lead the talks, NATO had to maintain a strong deterrence posture. And this is the deterrence part.
The Harmala Report is a key political and strategic document with a lasting impact on the alliance's strategic thinking, and it is still important today.
It has broadened NATO's approach to security and has anticipated the breakdown of the deadlock between East and West.
The departure of France from the integrated military command structure posed new challenges for NATO, in both political and military terms.
NATO was able to adapt and accommodate France's concern. In fact, the withdrawal accelerated the ongoing discussion about the role of the alliance in the world and opened the way for a more active and confident action in the field of arms control.
We'd like to thank you all for listening. If you want to know more, please go to our website where you'll find more sources and details. We look forward to welcoming you back in our next episode when we will discuss conventional forces and how NATO planned the defense of Europe during the Cold War. We would like to thank all the guests who appeared on this episode, and as always, we'd like to thank Mass Communication Specialist Brett Dodge for being our producer, and Paul Magus and the NATO Public Diplomacy Division for opening their recording studio to us.